Welcome to Disciplines for the Inner Life. Your host for this podcast is co-author Michael Benson. I have spent nearly 50 years in the preaching ministry, serving many roles in local churches, and for nearly a decade as chaplain to a Christian university. I have traveled the United States extensively as an evangelist. This podcast covers the book Disciplines for the Inner Life. It is a powerful devotional aid that has been called a perennial classic. The format offers readings from 176 books, 52 hymns, and 141 different writers. The purpose of this podcast is to go through the book. This book grew out of a concern that we Christians give time and attention to the inner life, hence the use of the word discipline in the title. Down through Christian history, various spiritual principles, rules, disciplines, and practices have aided the believer in the quest for a deeper knowledge of God. There were liturgies, lectionaries, prayer books, and guides for the hours and days of one's spiritual journey. One of the common threads of all these tools of spirituality was the recognition of the need for constancy in the establishment and deepening of a person's spiritual relationship with God. Underlying the writings of all those whose works have stood the test of time is the theme of faithfulness and regularity in spiritual practice. The spiritual rules, the spiritual director, the liturgy of the hours, spiritual journals, confessionals, the early Methodist class meetings, and many other requirements and customs arose from the need to develop a disciplined, ongoing relationship with God. Unfortunately, for most Protestants, at present there is both a dearth of such materials to be used and an ignorance of the wide use of such offices or disciplines in days gone by. In fact, we do not even have a common term for all we understand to describe the process. Probably devotions is the term most often used. Usually, if we ask someone, "How is your spiritual life?" we mean, "What is the state of your prayer life?" Terms like inner life, spiritual formation, spiritual life, interior life, and others used do not have the same common meaning to us. But even if we cannot define precisely our sickness or the pathway back to health, we are quite sure, both from the hunger in our hearts and from the meager Christian fruits of our lives, that we are far from a life that is rooted in the deep resources of God. Times of trial or other adverse circumstances may sometimes cause us to renew our intentions and resolves in this regard for a season. Usually, though, with the return of better times, or simply under the myriad pressures of life itself, we gradually relax our grip on our resolutions. Perhaps one of the reasons for our repeated failures in devotional practice and spiritual formation is because we attempt to make these forays into the depths without availing ourselves of the counsel and wisdom of those across the centuries who have made similar journeys fruitfully and victoriously. We are like, as Morton Kelsey noted, people who would not dream of tackling mathematics by starting to count on their fingers or toes. Rather, we try to make our spiritual pilgrimage entirely on our own. In reality, there has been a remarkable similarity to both the hindrances and aids to piety across the centuries, and in the journeys and treatises of both early and present-day saints and saintly people, there are recorded the struggles and the victories in virtually all the matters pertaining to the implementation of our inner intentions. It is the purpose of this podcast to provide a sampling of hymns, scriptures, and readings that will provide for you insight and guidance for the formation and nourishment of the inner life. We hope that this podcast will help you develop a foundation upon which you can begin to build strong disciplines into your life. Some of the material has been gathered in the study and research for this book, but most of the readings have come from books on our own library shelves, long ago underlined, and from writers who through the years, over and over, provided health and hope to our spirits. Likewise, much of the scripture selected is taken from those verses and passages that came to our minds in thinking of the weekly subject which we have chosen. The topics that we will cover in the podcast each week are arranged in a natural progression. We hope that this will lead you along the pathway to a deeper life in God. The first weeks deal with the awakening of spiritual awareness and exercising that awareness in prayer and study. That will be followed by a section concerning hindrances to living the spiritual life, and that is followed by a section of patterns for making all of this true in our lives. May this podcast be a faithful companion to you on your journey. I look forward to hearing from you in your comments and reviews. And thank you for joining me in this podcast, Disciplines for the Inner Life.